Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, presented by Salonis, Season 8, Episode 24. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Our special guest, this episode recorded live in the Bamboozer Podcasting Studio, Chop Talk Europe in Barcelona, is Arianne Parisi, Executive Vice President, Chief Digital Officer, JD Sports. Now, if you don't know JD Sports, they're established in 81 with one store northwest of England. They now are a leading global omni-channel retailer, 3,400 stores, 38 territories, presence in UK, Europe, North America, and Asia Pacific. All right, so let's talk about Leaders Leap. I watched a great webinar you did yesterday, and it's what now, the 2-month anniversary of the release of the book in the US, and I think it's coming soon in the UK. How's it going?
Oh, it's going well. Yeah, we had fun down in Hotlanta talking about the book. Yeah, but we're at the 2-month mark, and as you mentioned, the UK release is on Thursday, if people are listening to this close to the release date of this episode. So point of privilege as a co-host here, asking for some reviews. Reviews are very important to help people find the book. So if you've read Leaders Leap, I would love it if you would give me a review on Amazon or also Goodreads. We'll put some links in the show notes. So far, the book's got a 4.9 out of 5 rating. So, be great for people to keep that average high.
Nudge that up. Yeah, nudge that up. Yeah.
And of course, if you haven't read it yet, I don't know what you're waiting for. One great way to get access to the book at a low price is there's a special price on Kindles. And actually, both Leaders Leap and my first book, Remarkable Retail, are available for the equivalent of US $9.99. So look for that worldwide on Amazon.
Let's get into the news of the week. It's a bit of a slow week. We're past earnings season and summer solstice. Happy summer solstice, by the way, to everyone. We're here in Toronto. We're under a heat dome, which I guess is basically AKA spring day in Texas.
I was going to say, this is the part of the year where I see, and I'm not going to name any names, but several people I follow on social media that live in the New York area that start whining about when it's 95 degrees or something like that. And I'm like, dude, it's 104. Shut up. But yes, so as a former Northerner, I just don't want to hear it from anybody about how hot it is.
Well, we got some stuff to talk about. Actually, we got a pretty busy episode to go through. Let's talk about U.S. housing starts. They're so important to a whole bunch of different categories, including home goods. And we've talked about the interest rates kind of cauterizing the market. But what did you see in the latest numbers?
Well, it's pretty discouraging, I have to say, because, a lot of markets, not just the U.S., have a real housing shortage. And a bit of a surprise that the U.S. starts for the month were down again. And I forget the exact gap between the number of homes basically needed given population growth and the like versus the ones that are being built. But there's quite a sizable gap. And with the starts being down, that gap is only getting bigger. Now, why do we care about this? Well, for a couple of reasons as relates to retail. Number one is there's the direct impact on spending on home-related products. So we've talked about a lot over the last couple of years that pretty much anybody who's in the home-related categories has really struggled because there's great correlation between new housing purchases and moves driving that spending. The other piece, which you could argue is maybe even more important for retail writ large, is that because housing costs continue to go up, so with the housing shortage, that affects both rentals as well as people's ability to buy a home.
Affordability.
So if you're sucking up more of your discretionary income to pay rent, to pay mortgages, to pay taxes, et cetera, you have less money to spend on other things. So we're not really seeing any signs that the housing market or the kind of home recession is easing. If anything, it looks like it might be tightening up a little bit. Now, as interest rates start to come down in the second half of the year, hopefully gets a bit unfrozen. But right now, it still looks pretty stuck, frankly.
It is the situation here in Canada and, as well. I mean, the mortgage market's a bit different, but we've called it a discretionary recession. I mean, there's so much pressure on Canadians when they renew their mortgage that it just sucks up, like we think, like 30-40% of discretionary spending, right? It just, when you got to find an extra $500 a month, that's a big deal for anybody, right? So, and we'll keep a close eye on that because, as you said, it drives so many categories. Let's talk about NVIDIA. So we can now say that we've had someone from the world's most valuable company, Zita Martin on the podcast.
Yeah, I wanted to mention this. I mean, first of all, it's just unbelievable, really, and makes me a little bit nervous how high this stock has gone. So, yeah, we've got this sort of, I don't want to say sleepy tech company, but relatively sleepy a couple of years ago.
It wasn't a sleepy interview. We
the interview.
Shout out to Azita. It was very popular.
Super interesting. But, here's a company that not a lot of people were paying attention to 2 or 3 years ago that has zoomed past Apple to become the world's most valuable company. Whether it'll stay there, TBD. But it relates a little bit to a much more micro kind of story, which is an announcement this past week that Target is piloting a generative AI chatbot to help sales associates answer customers' questions. Now, this is a very particular thing, but I was starting to hear more and more, as we go to conferences or just see what's out in the news, of very specific applications of the generative AI technology, and that ties to NVIDIA because their chips and some of their platforms power that. So, somehow or other, we're either going to have to see, not that it's all about retail, because there's plenty of applications of generative AI outside of retail, but in order to support that incredible valuation of NVIDIA, we're going to have to see real world examples and great incremental profits driven through the use of the technology that NVIDIA chips powers. So it's interesting to see what's coming out of retailers that they're talking about in the public domain. Obviously, I know of some things that are going on with some of my clients that they're not ready to talk about yet. But I think using the chatbots is a particularly interesting application of AI. So we'll see where that goes. Just a pilot at this point, but we'll see if that gets scaled up.
Let's talk about, kind of continuing on the theme of affordability and how affordability crisis, whatever you want to call it, and how consumers are dealing with it. Let's talk about knockoffs and private brands. It's a strategy for sure. There's some great McKinsey research about this, about how and exactly in what ways people trade down or start to make different decisions. So talk about what you're seeing.
Well, one of my predictions last year, which was, I think, pretty much came true, is that private brands in the U.S. in particular, and many folks will know, particularly if they live in Western Europe, that private brands historically have been quite strong in a lot of UK and other European retailers. But in North America, we're seeing continued growth, and it's really the difference between the tide and knockoffs. As it used to be that a lot of the private brands were just basically a cheap and cheerful version of a national brand, but there was really no attempt to differentiate them in particular or make them the kind of brands that consumers would really crave. But what we're seeing is the strategy to make these brands truly brands, not just labels. And so there was a Wall Street Journal article this past week about some of the different share positions of private brands at major retailers. So, for example, private brands, and this is probably not too surprising if people know these retailers, private brands represent the dominant percent of sales at chains like Aldi and Trader Joe's. But, that strategy is largely built around having their own brands. But even if you look at many other retailers like Costco, Walmart, H-E-B, Kroger, private brands now represent over 25% of the total sales at those major retailers. Target's just under 25, but my guess is at the rate they're investing behind growing their private brands, they will soon be at that percentage. So that's a pretty significant shift. And of course, it remains to be seen if people have less inflationary concerns or whether that share growth will slow down. But at this point, I think, retailers like it because it gives them better margins if they're managed properly, and consumers like it because they get more bang for the buck, basically.
Yeah, sticking with grocery, the interesting development up here, up north in the Great White North, Empire, which is Sobeys and a number of other grocers, had and has an exclusive deal with Ocado, that very sophisticated, very highly automated e-commerce warehouse platform. And they'd opened up warehouses in Toronto and in Montreal, and they were going to do one in Vancouver. And just to hit the pause button. And in the release, Michael Medline's great leader, Michael Medline, who, by the way, last time I saw him, I gave him a copy of your book. So it might be informing his thinking, I just want to say, about pilots and things like that. They paused it and he said, listen, we're not making any money on this. And we were kind of taken aback, I'm obviously paraphrasing, by the lack of enthusiasm for e-commerce amongst Canadian shoppers. Now, that's not just a Canadian issue. I go back, we were talking off mic about Peapod back in the early 2000s. Like, people have been enthusiastic about getting big business happening in grocery e-commerce for decades, but the consumers seem to be, particularly in North America, just less enthusiastic about it.
Well, longtime listeners of the podcast will know that we were pretty skeptical about the great acceleration narrative around online grocery. Not that it hasn't grown considerably, but this idea that online grocery was going to go to the moon, I've been skeptical of it, and for two fundamental reasons. The unit economics are extremely tough. It is expensive to pick, pack, and deliver to someone's home a mix of goods. And consumers, particularly, you could argue with the inflationary pressures, are becoming price sensitive. So a lot of people, I think, really misread the great growth in grocery shopping online during COVID because consumers were more inclined to do it because they didn't want to go out. Grocers were more inclined to invest in it because they were trying to preserve market share. Well, once you're no longer that worried about going out shopping, and once you, as the retailer, start to look at the profitability of it and discover it's generally pretty terrible, well, what are you going to do? You're going to either raise your prices, which will affect demand, obviously, or you're going to try to merchandise your way around it to do things like come have the customer pick it up, which has, if you do a little bit of math there, it's much cheaper for the customer to come get it than the grocer to pay somebody or, have Instacart go deliver it. So I think we're just seeing the collision of basic supply and demand. It's not that consumers aren't interested in it. It's just that the economics of it make it tough to sustain at a high growth rate.
Well, and I think it gets right back to buying versus shopping. Your theory about, listen, if everybody just wanted to get a thing done, if that's all grocery shopping was, then yeah, you could see a lot more growth in e-commerce. But it's not. I mean, I remember, when I had little kids, we went to the grocery store and we kind of taught them math, and we was just time to, spend time with them, right? Going and being social. Kroger, by the way, has done the same thing. Kroger's the other Ocado partner, and they paused some build of the Ocado warehouses in places where they didn't have physical stores, thinking, hey, it's a pure play. But, pure play plays are just very difficult. So there you go. Is this a good segue? Let's talk about GLP-1 drugs and weight loss, because I think this is starting to impact how and what people consume. And we're starting to see, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal about this. Apparel being impacted, and retailers and apparel manufacturers starting to make some interesting decisions and thoughts around it.
Well, there's been this little bit of a narrative about and I think Scott Galloway was one of the first people to talk about the possibility of an Ozempic recession. And that was in the context of, if people are going on these weight loss drugs, they'll be spending less money on certain food products. And that could be very bad for the food manufacturers. Well, this is sort of the flip side of it, which as people lose weight, well, their clothes don't fit them so well anymore. So they need to buy new clothes. So yeah, the article you referenced, the Wall Street Journal, is about as these weight loss drugs expand and more people are on them, is it actually driving apparel growth? So I still
and smaller sizing, right? They also made the point that they were looking at the sizing, which for years has been kind of going up, but now is starting to go the other way and a little more adventurous, because people are like, hey, I fit into more interesting clothes now, kind of thing. I guess.
So I think it's super interesting just to think about. In the scheme of things, because of the availability of these drugs, as well as just in general the cost and people's perhaps concerns about safety and whatnot, relatively small to the total. But if these drugs continue to grow, and we're going to see other classes of drugs and whatnot come on into the market over the next year or two, it could be quite significant in terms of how it affects different sectors of retail. So I think it's definitely an interesting area to watch. I often think about, whether we're talking about AI or retail media networks or whatever it might be, listening to the quarterly earnings calls to see what CEOs and CFOs talk about as explanations or early kind of indicators of trends. So this could be one we'll hear about next earnings season. All
right, let's talk about Netflix. We actually mentioned this before because it was I think it was going to be in your backyard, but we didn't have a lot of details. Now we got details. So Netflix is going physical in Texas.
Yeah, about 6 months ago or so, they talked about that Netflix were working on an entertainment concept called Netflix House, which will have food, drinks, Netflix merchandise, and some other things, but they didn't share a lot of details. Well, now they are starting to share some details, which is that the first 2 locations will be opening next year. They're going to be in former department stores, one just north of me here in Dallas at the Galleria, and the other at a mall that I'm sure many people will know, the very large and successful King of Prussia Mall in Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia. So these are going to be about 100,000 square feet. So pretty sizable operations. So we'll have to see exactly what this looks like. But, I think it's pretty interesting. I don't know if this is something that Netflix is going to open, 500 of or whatever. Yeah. But in terms of what it could mean for some leading department store or potentially reuse, I guess, of old department stores, or just something that could be bolted on to an existing mall, could be pretty interesting. And obviously Netflix has just incredible content and resources and interesting ways they could blend physical and digital. So I think it's something to watch, but I think we've got about another year before we'll get to check these out in person, but it's going to be easy for me to do because it's just about 15 minutes away. I do find it a bit ironic that we've had Disney pull back on their retail operations, while now we've got Netflix moving forward into it. Now, whether that'll lead to any kind of theme park kind of thing or not, I don't know. But clearly Netflix is on a good growth trajectory in a way that Disney's been struggling with for a few years.
Well, if it was me and I was buying merch, it would be the fantastic Army of the Dead shot in Las Vegas, because it was fun to see Las Vegas torn apart and becoming it was fun to see Elvis impersonators as zombies. Anyway, so that would be my pick from Netflix. Let's talk about a fun moment of Zen. Talk about, you sent this to me and it just made me laugh like a lot.
Well, so this is a little morsel here, but on Threads, a guy that I follow, Reuven Perlman, who's a New Yorker magazine writer, wrote that Temu is what happens when you ask the question, what if everything had the same quality as free in-flight earbuds? So I just thought that was a brilliant comment on the state of disposable merchandise. It
is equivalent to my landfill direct model analysis.
Exactly. Yes. Sad, but true. But we give you the unvarnished truth here on the Remarkable Retail Podcast.
All right. Well, let's take a break now and hear from our presenting sponsor, Celonis. And then we'll get to our fantastic interview and learn more about JD Sports. Want to ramp up speed and productivity for your entire retail operation? In the Celonis Process Mining for Dummies Handbook, we show you how Celonis process mining technology, enhanced with process intelligent AI, can help you streamline performance across your entire retail business so you can drive lasting value from end to end. That means purchasing, supply chain, omni-channel execution, merchandising, and customer service processes, all managed and optimized through one powerful software solution. To get your free copy of Process Mining for Dummies and see how it's generated millions in value for brands around the world like Aldi, Globus, and Edeka, head to Celonis.com/remarkable retail.
Well, Arianne, welcome to our fabulous remote podcast studio high above Barcelona. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. Thank you.
We usually just like to start out by learning a little bit more about our guests. So maybe you could just tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, how you ended up getting to your role at JD Sports.
Absolutely. So I've had a career in retail, and it started more kind of on the buying and planning side, so more relative to physical product. Mm-hmm. Rooted in that, I started at Sports Authority, which most Americans will remember, national sporting goods retailer. Rest in peace.
Sure.
So that was my early career days were kind of on the buying, planning side of the business. And I tended to take on roles that were a little bit where the company was pressing into new territory. So always kind of had this innovation bend and a little bit of a drive toward kind of pressing into, new areas that might create revenue for us in the future. At a point, I was really curious about how to create great customer experiences. And I had grown up with a relationship to Nordstrom as a retailer, knowing that they were very customer-centric. And so I took the chance to move to Seattle. My husband and I had just been married, and we moved out to Seattle, and I took on a role with Nordstrom, so spent some of my career there. And at that moment in time, made my first foray into kind of the digital specific landscape.
I hear that's going to be big.
Yeah.
Now, what year was that? Like, what if we kind of mark something
That
like?
was 2011. Yeah, Nordstrom was kind of an early adopter of a lot of digital technology, and so they started to expand into like the extended online assortment space. You know, this is like a department store retailer that's now selling couches through dropship, and so they were pretty early days, and I had observed that, and it really interested me to say, like, okay, let me learn more about this, because in the buying side of the business, you know, again, e-commerce had not yet really been too big of a thing. So started a little, you know, was in some product categories at Nordstrom, and then moved into more of a digital space. And eventually, for personal reasons, my family and I came back to Colorado, where I've been for the last 9 years now in this stint. And I came on to a part of the Finish Line group. So Finish Line, you know, mostly a athletic footwear retailer. Came in through an M&A play in the running specialty area, and then eventually started running digital for Finish Line. And in 2018, Finish Line was purchased by JD Sports. And I'll tell a little bit more about JD, because I think especially American listeners won't really know much about it, and it's an exciting brand to discuss. So JD purchased Finish Line in 2018, and then in 2019 we launched JDSports.com. And we started to press the JD brand kind of into the North American region. And we started with 5 stores, and then now we're at about 250 since then. So we've really, you know, we're trying to launch this new brand in the U.S. And my journey then was leading digital for North America. And then in the past year, I stepped into a global role. So we have reorganized as a JD business, kind of on the premise that what got you here won't get you there. So we're, you know, over $10 billion in annual turnover at this point. We've grown very organically throughout all of our global markets, and so it's time for us to really start to think about how do we centralize some of our strategy and kind of leverage that size and scale. And so the role I play today is as the Chief Digital Officer at the JD Group. So I support all of our teams globally around kind of the digital strategy and execution of that vision. And really, you know, I say digital, and that is kind of the primary focus, but it's really customer based. So kind of moving us into this new era of Omni-Channel. And I know that part's not new, but I think doing it well is what's new. We're all saying it, and now it's time to actually execute it. So, so really a customer centric lens through how we, you know, think about our evolution in the next phase. And so that's where I am today.
So a couple of follow-up questions. Did you always want to be in business, a technologist? I mean, you started as a merchant. Did you love product? Like when you were growing up, what did you want to be? And sometimes retail's described as the accidental career. You've had a very purposeful evolution, kind of, sort of. But did you wind up where you thought you'd when you started? Yeah,
it's a great question. And whenever I speak to like people who are young in their career, I always say this: I never had a linear view of what I could be or where I would go. I had no concept for retail, but I loved fashion. And mind you, I grew up in Alaska, so loving fashion in Alaska is a pretty I don't know quite what that meant.
I'm picturing some Venn diagrams of
the intersection. Yeah, I loved snow boots and parkas. But I knew I loved fashion, and then when I learned that retail was a career, it was a bit of an unlock, right? And so you have this. To me, it's this blend of art and science, and ultimately it's teamwork and it's competitive. And so I wouldn't say that I understood what industry I would be in, but I knew kind of the dynamics of what excited me, and all of those things started to align within retail.
Fantastic.
So that was kind of the genesis.
Fantastic. So okay, let's unpack JD for all the listeners. I mean, it's interesting. You've picked up the global. You're talking turnover, which isn't the kind of the language of the U.S. retailer. You're already talking.
You're right.
We're here in Europe, but
you're
right. Talking turns. So tell the listeners all about JD. You describe yourself as in North America. I'm from Canada. Are you in Canada? You know, Mexico, all that stuff. So lay out the groundwork for a minute or two.
Absolutely. So JD is originally a British brand, started in the north of England about 40 years ago. So very humble beginnings, and just has had crazy acceleration of growth over the last 10 years, let's say, and especially in the last 5. So the business itself is a sports fashion retail business primarily. We do own some outdoor fascias, and we play in other complementary categories, but our main pillar is JD Sports. And so when we talk about sports fashion, it's we retail the top athletic brands, but through the lens of fashion. And so most of our consumers are not necessarily, running in our product per se, but they're interpreting it kind of culturally. And so it's a really fun space to be in, because you get to work with the big athletic brands, but you get to do it in a way that's really culturally relevant. So that I think is kind of the magic and the secret of JD.
What's the catalyst for that kind of growth? As you know better than anyone, it's a very competitive sector. So what is it that, there's no shortage of brands that are out there trying to do this spectrum of, performance all the way to fashion. So what is it, the catalyst that's been that secret sauce to help them grow the way that you're describing?
Yeah, I think that the catalyst of it is really just a consumer connection. And if you go back historically to who JD was at the beginning, it's like kind of born of the streets of Liverpool, right? And it's got this origin story that's like very connected to the consumer.
Authentic.
Very authentic. Yeah. And it's always been that way. And I think, just as any company kind of in a growth phase, our challenge is how do we keep that consumer connection and how do we stay relevant while also achieving global scale? And I've seen that firsthand in North America, where we're trying to bring a British brand to life, which we all know that the landscape is littered with failed attempts, right?
It's not the first one.
It's not the first. And so, I wouldn't say, check, we've done it, but you do feel this tremendous momentum. And especially in the past 2 years or so, we've really started to feel the momentum. So I think at the core of it, we get to play in a space that is, yes, competitive. There's a lot of folks trying to participate here, but I think we are the most consumer connected brand. And I think we understand, that what we deliver on behalf of our customers. And it's it's this, again, the playfulness of the category. Our CEO calls it the casualization of kind of the world, right? It's like, we're pretty fortunate that once you wear sneakers, you never really go back, right?
Well,
And so
I'm a testament to that. I remember the days you'd walk around these conferences in your dress shoes, and it was hard. And now nobody's wearing dress shoes anymore. They're wearing all kinds
Except
of
me,
different.
but
You are wearing dress shoes.
we'll get you
but
next.
yesterday I was way more casual.
So, 2 quick questions. How many stores in total? Like, how big's the fleet? And then, where would I find you typically? Are you more a mall retailer? You're a standalone retailer? Just those 2 quick things.
Yeah. So over 3,400 stores, over 30 countries. I think it's maybe 35 countries or so at this point. Big acquisition announced recently of the potential acquisition of Hibbett, which would add another 1,200 stores, right? So some significant growth still in the pipeline. And you would find us, it's interesting. So JD, in North America especially, is primarily in mall. I would say similarly across the world, although there's just a lot more street side locations globally. I think that's just the nature of retail globally.
Sure.
It's
Less
a little
malls.
different. Yeah. So if your mall is more, we have flagships obviously in every major city. Phenomenal flagship in Times Square. For Americans, if you check that out, it really represents the brand really well. So we're trying to have outposts in every major city that can really be representative of the brand, but then at scale, we're in the mall.
Great.
Yeah, I got to enjoy, when I was at the World Retail Congress, I went on a store tour with your CEO in the Champs-Élysées store, which is really terrific.
Yeah.
But so maybe shift gears a little bit. You've had this front row seat and the evolution of digital retail, omni-channel, I like to call it harmonized retail, but whatever you want to call it. Maybe can you give us just a sense of what you think has been most important in driving success, in terms of what you've seen the past decade or so?
Yeah. We all have a lot of ambition against omni-channel. And actually, I love the phrase harmonized. I think it's beautiful.
Let's all take a moment just to let that sink in.
It's so eloquent.
That's what I do.
Yeah. So I think, I hate all the buzziness of all of this, right? Omni-channel. Yeah. The reality of it is that enterprise retail has been built in silos, and that was in service to driving revenue. And that was the only way that made sense. Right. And so most of us in enterprise retail have come up through, even if your remit spanned, the 2 channels, like you really could see how the technology and the systems and the incentive structure and the people organizational structures were really in service to these kind of channel-led mindsets. And I think about it still today with our P&Ls that are channel specific, right? And you have to have accountability down to that line item, so it makes sense. But I think that the evolution really comes through, first of all, it's fundamentally how do your systems, tools, processes, and people support this omni-channel mindset. So I think most of us in enterprise retail are on an evolution and a path around, how do we kind of disassemble and reassemble our fundamental kind of systems, and how do we do that in a way that creates agility for the future, and how do we do it in a way that doesn't take 10 years, because it can, right? So how do you simultaneously plot this course for long-term sustainable growth, but then also deliver wins against it? So I think all of that is really obvious, but the thing that I keep kind of coming back to is more about the people and the incentives, because what I'm realizing is that the way our organizations were built was to incentivize folks to drive, strong business in one channel.
Right.
So we have to really uncouple and unpack that, and it's everything around even the way you spend your marketing dollars, right? Do you do it in a way that is intended to drive lower funnel conversion in a digital channel, or do you think about it from a brand building standpoint and what are your teams incentivized to do? And we had some discussion yesterday also about omni-channel fulfillment, right? So fulfillment from stores. What are the incentives for store associates within that? So ultimately, I think it comes down to people, it comes down to the organization and the way you're structured, and it comes down to your incentives. And what are people accountable to, and how are you rewarding them on those KPIs?
Why do you think it's been so hard to get to where we are? Because I led multi-channel integration at Sears, also RIP, more than 20 years ago. And at the Neiman Marcus Group, I was responsible for, we called it multi-channel. And I can tell you my board presentations 16, 17 years ago were about unifying the channels, silos belong on farm, like all these kinds of aspirations, I guess you could say, in a lot of cases. And there definitely was a lot of pushback in terms of the investment, in terms of what the company was used to in terms of managing the business and so forth. So I kind of get it, given that was so long ago. Yeah. But now here we are with technology evolving, with, I think, the obvious blurring of the lines between channels, the omni-channel fulfillment opportunities. You see companies like Walmart and Target, which fulfill a huge amount of their e-commerce orders from stores. And so we still seem to be cycling around this notion of omni-channel or unified or seamless or whatever you want to call it. What do you think has been so hard to get to tangible results for some of these companies?
Yeah. I want to go back and just call out that you cut yourself off, but you said silos belong on farms. Mm-hmm. And so I just want that was funny.
Well, I would like to correct. It is in my first book, and I've used it in speeches, but credit goes to Bob Schamberg, who was the VP of marketing, who stood up at one of our Sears executive or annual retreat meetings when we were talking about this new world we were going to take on, and pointed out that the silos, the way we operate, were the biggest problem. So he said, I just want to say silos belong on farms. So that's
I used that once.
25 years old, I think, at this point, maybe.
I used that once on a panel on a loss prevention conference, and one of my panelists was a military guy, and he says, actually, they're nuclear missiles. That's when I think of silos. And I'm like, okay.
Important clarification.
Yeah.
Context for being very important.
That one feels a little aggressive. I'm really just stalling because I don't know quite the answer here, but I think
it's a hard answer. I mean, I have a similar background. I sold the first pair of Levi's jeans online in '98 in the world, launched Hudson's Bay in 2000. Many of the same discussions, and the same discussions culturally, because I think it's a big cultural thing. Yeah. It's actually what you write about in your book, your second book, about that need to break through. Listen, you fight the cannibalization argument, and I'm always like, you might as well fight against gravity, because you're thinking about this wrong, but it's taken a long time to change that culture of. And it's still there. You talk to store operators, and like I don't care if you allocate by my zone. I want that customer in to fill the basket by the impulse goods. So there's still a very vibrant discussion happening at all levels, right?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways you could come at it, but I've been contemplating this, and one of the thoughts that I had is that because retail is so fun, and I think a lot of us get into it because of the competitiveness of it. One of my colleagues, John Hall at our company, has always said this, is like, you get a daily scorecard, right? So retail, it feels good to those who are competitive because literally, I mean, sometimes you get an hourly scorecard. You can measure your results in such a quick kind of timeline. And I've been wondering if part of this is because, yes, you could say systems, you could say, people are the cannibalization piece, but I think all of our KPIs are somewhat, because you can measure them on a tight time frame, maybe they're a little bit too short-sighted. So I've been kind of contemplating that because I think that the long-term solve comes from maybe longer-term KPIs, and those are around the customer. And they're less transactional, right? Because if we are measuring ourselves on a daily basis from a sales by channel perspective and all of the KPIs associated to drive revenue, then I think that the omni-channel piece of it truly comes into play in the longer term, and it comes in the customer tracking and the KPIs associated with customer versus just kind of the transactional KPIs. Right. And those are harder to measure. It's harder to it's because it's more difficult. It's harder to track the customer. If you truly, and we all say this, we root it in the through the customer lens.
Right. Yeah.
Nobody really does that. What you do is you root it in your sales, and did you drive sales or did you drive profit, right? Yeah. Because the customer KPIs are harder to track and they're harder to measure, but ultimately I think that those are the ones that tell us, like, are we doing this well? Are we doing it right? But it's long term.
Sure.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
You were on the stage yesterday. You shared already a little bit of what you're talking about incentives and structures around omni-channel fulfillment in the store. What else what kind of other wisdom were you dropping on the audience yesterday around, like, what were the big insights that you say, listen, if you walk away from this session, just remember these 1 or 2, 3 things, and it's a win for it. How did you approach that?
Yeah, that was fun to be on the stage, and Mark and Scott, who I was with, it was really good dialogue with them both before and after as well. So that was great. The incentives, to me, I keep coming back to that. I mean, I think we had a lot of buzz around our touch points. Of course, we all, kind of talked a lot about our touch points. I'm like, yep. Well,
did AI come up? It's been
AI
18 minutes and we haven't said that
yet. I know.
Yet.
It did. It came up briefly, and we didn't really go there, which was great. I had a really. I said to Adam, who was our facilitator, I gave him the most analog response ever to the AI question. I mean, I'll say for me, it was a lot about incentive structure, KPIs, and then also the store associates. Like, I've been thinking a lot about this as well. Our store associates. So JD employs 75,000 associates globally, and a lot of the experiences that we want to deliver are only delivered if our store associates are on board to it, right? So when I talk about incentives around fulfillment or whatever that might be, when I talk about omni-channel enablement, it's like, actually, if we enable those store associates and we empower them and we listen to them and we give them the tools to do their jobs well, that's probably the best way we can serve consumers, not just in store, but in an omni-channel as well, right?
So as you think about just kind of casting our minds forward in terms of some of the things you think are going to be important to delivering these remarkable experiences, consistent experiences, however we want to describe them, what you just said is interesting to me, and it's actually something we talked about on stage last night, which is the balance between digital. It's not exactly what we talked about, but the balance between digital and human-centered retail, or how to make that work. And we certainly hear a lot of retailers talk about how important, maybe it's lip service, but how important the store associates are. But there's lots of things that really deliver the magic in a store in interaction with a sales associate, right? So do you think about how the technology positions the sales associates to serve the customer better? Like, what's that experience meant to be?
Yeah, absolutely.
In store.
Yeah. One of the things that I was asked yesterday was related to the product organization. So not the physical product we sell, but digital product. And one of the changes that we've made this year is we've implemented a product team that spans the channels, right? So our product team, which does our user experience research, does our kind of conversion optimization, assesses use cases and business requirements for the new tools that we're going to deploy, either developing them ourselves or going to market to find them from a third party. That organization now spans both channels. So what that has allowed us to do, and I have a great product leader in that space, and what he has been very intentional about is getting into the stores as the starting point. So that has actually been the first place he's gone, is into the stores to run these sessions, to say, what does great service look like to our associates, and what can they teach us, what can they tell us, right? Where do we learn about the pain points from them? And so I think, we can be really high-minded in corporate retail, and you can be really high-minded in digital retail and tech. And the most humbling thing you can do is go into the stores, which I did, by the way, recently. Yeah. We had our whole executive team at our East London store in Stratford, and it's a massive store. It's our biggest volume store, and the space is just phenomenal. And we were in the back room doing click and collect orders. I merchandised the sales floor. I was running shoes. And all of a sudden, you start to see these things that you think should be really easy to execute, and they're not, right? So you see that through the lens of the associate. So my point is, we have to organize ourselves as a corporate organization around a structure that's going to serve our associates, and so we're trying to do that. And I think the more we do that, you recognize that if you enable the associates to do their jobs well, then the customer experience really benefits. So that's kind of the starting point for us.
I like that thread. Our conversation, which is now our podcast up a couple of weeks ago, is why physical retail matters even more now in a digital age. Yeah. Because if you do it, you either can do it right or you don't do it right. It's almost analog or binary now, because one is an amplifier or an accelerator, and the other is just a tremendous drag on the business. Who was it last year we were talking to, and he had this great phrase: "Is the fleet can only move as fast as the slowest boat." And I was talking to a retailer who said, all this stuff is great, digital shelf tags. I'm in northern Canada. I got dial-up until, he started hooking up Starlink. He's actually hooked up Starlink to his stores, and now they've suddenly brought all that tech. But he said, all this stuff you're imagining, it can't be done in half my stores because we're kind of fairly analog. So anyway, it's just a great conversation. So what's next? I mean, obviously you got, it's a growth, integrating brands and integrating platforms and watching out for cyber and all that kind of stuff. But in your mind, what's next for you and for the business?
Yeah, well, like I said, we're on a massive push for growth.
Yeah.
And so it's exciting to be a part of a growth brand, right? So I think if you look at the landscape of the JD organization, I kind of explained that Northern England roots, kind of pushed into Europe, moved into the US, into APAC. I think taking on North America in a big way at scale. Mm-hmm. So we are in Canada. We have an operation out of Vancouver. One of the things that we've done, I think JD has done really well, is with acquisitions, taken on the local teams, right? So we have Canadians running our business in Canada who can really teach us about the Canadian landscape, which is very different. And same thing with the Americans in the U.S.,
It's process, not process.
I'm learning, process. Exactly. Yeah. That one, that in the UK,
it kind of works. Yeah. It kind of resonates there.
So I think our North American and our U.S. push is kind of the biggest thing on the horizon. And it's a grand ambition. We're at about 250 stores now in North America, and we think the ceiling is far higher. So we think the ceiling is closer to that 600 mark.
Wow.
So growth at scale in North America, brand awareness.
Yep.
As you both know, it takes a lot to really kind of penetrate the American market and to become front of mind, and especially for our target consumer who's young, they're fast, right? That 18
even to find the right real
old.
estate at that scale. Right?
Absolutely, yes. The real estate conversations are intense. So, and I think with that, it's how do we preserve the heritage and what makes JD really excellent and what has made it resonant, and how do we make sure that fits with a North American consumer, and how do we preserve? You were referring to kind of just like that excellence at scale, just getting the basics right? How do we deliver this in a way that is truly on brand? But we're very excited about the North American growth path.
Very exciting. Well, great ambitions, but great talent. Clearly, you and the team are doing amazing things. So, well, listen, thanks, Arianne, for joining us here in the Bamboozer podcast studio here at Shop Talk Barcelona in Europe. It was a real treat to chit and chat with you and get to know about JD Sports a bit more, and I expect to hear a lot more. So once again, on behalf of Steve and myself, thanks for joining us on the Remarkable Retail Podcast. Appreciate that. Thank you both. So JD Sports, not necessarily a brand for North Americans that kind of, is front of mind the way that, a Dick's Sporting Goods is or even a Sport Check in Canada. But they're a big player, man. They're coming up. I mean, they're starting to compete with the likes of, in a different way, the global behemoth that is Decathlon. What did you think of the interview, and what do you think of that brand? Well, I've been learning a lot about JD Sports. I really didn't know too much about them. I actually got a little bit of a deeper insight when I went to visit their store. Actually, it was a store tour as part of the World Retail Congress, and we went to their literally brand new flagship store on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. And it was just interesting to see their particular take on the world of sporting goods. I mean, certainly smaller stores than we see with Dick's Sporting Goods. I would say much more of a youthful feel, for sure, in the way they're positioning the brand. And so brand when you think about, there's sometimes when I think about what else could you do in certain categories, just I don't know if this is the best analogy, but when we were talking to Joe Kudler from Viore, it's kind of well, what else is there to do in the athletic, athleisure space, right? But along comes a brand that, or a company that finds a different niche and a different approach to a large category. And I feel like JD is doing the same kind of thing with quite a lot of success. And, part of figuring out how to reflect that brand, in both a physical world as well as a digital world, and bring those things together, of course, is a lot of what we heard her talk about. So I think it's clearly a brand to watch
globally. Certainly their expansion and growth within North America is particularly new and exciting. So we'll see how that plays out.
Thanks for tuning in. New episodes of Season 8, presented by Celonis, will air every Tuesday. Be sure and tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us. And if you liked our episode, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts.
I'm Steve Dennis, author of Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption, and my brand new book, Leaders Leap, Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, which is available in hardcover, ebook, and Audible formats just about anywhere you prefer to buy your books. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant, keynote speaker, and media entrepreneur. You can learn more about me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.